I'm here today with Kehinde Ojo of the International Fellowship of Evangelical Students, known here in the United States as InterVarsity. And Kehinde, welcome to this podcast, sponsored by the book When Money Goes on Mission, Fundraising and Giving in the 21st Century.
Thank you, Rob. It's good to finally meet you face to face after many years of working together through Skype and Zoom.
Yes, this is a deep pleasure of mine and a real honor. Today's podcast, we're going to focus on indigenous and local fundraising and how you got started in your calling and actually your walk of faith with God in student work, but also in local fundraising at the same time in Western Nigeria, where you were going to college. Why don't you tell us a little bit about this startup story?
Well, thank you, Rob. Again, my joy to be here and to be on this podcast with you. My journey started more than 30 years now when I first came to Christ in the university through the witness of IFES Nigeria. I'd given Christ found me, I like to put it that way, when I was attending an outreach event. It was a breakfast meeting of the Full Gospel Businessmen's Fellowship. But because I was an undergraduate at the time, the ideal place for me to grow up in my faith was on the campus. And IFES Nigeria was there to provide that support, that encouragement, that discipleship and leadership development for me to grow in my knowledge of God and God's purposes. So prior to that, my desire was to studying engineering was to work in an oil company. And come to think of it, Chevron, which was Gulf Oil Company at the time, was highest paying oil company in Nigeria. And I did all my industrial training with Chevron Oil Company.
So you were on a fast track to the highest paying job an engineer could get in Nigeria at the time.
Absolutely. And because I was a Christian now at this time, I thought God has it all arranged perfectly for me to be this Christian engineer who provides resources for God's work. Guess what happened? A week to my final exams in the university, God called me to full-time Christian work. And surprisingly, I think to some friends of mine, I said yes. And that changed entirely the trajectory of my life.
God does that, doesn't he? I mean, here you were, set for life, able to marry, able to raise a family, able to own a nice home, able to rise in status and power in the country, and God calls you away to ministry and you say yes. One of the things I love about IFES is how it has prepared leaders around the world. In my work, as I first began this work and first began traveling and meeting elders and leaders and mission leaders and church leaders in countries, I would ask them, how did they get started in their work? And I kept hearing this same story about IFES and its ability. It seemed like the ministry, even though it was on campus and it was evangelization, it was discipling leaders and preparing leaders. It was almost universal. In fact, that's what led me to IFES in the first place, to make a grant. I found them out and sought them out rather than them seeking out first fruit.
This is important. This is important that you mentioned that you sought IFES out, because you wouldn't believe this. My model for grant agencies is actually taking responsibility and ownership to discover where God would have them invest their resources. So I'm glad to hear this example, because this is my model of how agencies who provide grants should run. Oftentimes we have too many layers in terms of application to get a grant, when in some ways there should be a sense of ownership by the grant agency to seek out opportunities to invest in God's kingdom. But guess what? Supporting the work of IFES globally, I think is a very wise decision by First Fruit. I'm a beneficiary of that.
Well, tell us about that grant and tie it together to your own understanding of local funding, which was already well developed by the time this would have been a grant further along in First Fruit's work with IFES. but the grant 9 years ago that established the program that you're working
that
in
I'm leading, yeah.
now in developing local funding for the national and campus chapters of IFES in the 170 countries where you work. But prior to that, when you were a student leader coming out of college and going full-time into campus work, you developed local funding.
I did.
Tell us about that.
So when God called me to Christian work, generally what people would have is a kind of fear. Can God use me? Can He provide for me? Can I trust God enough for my resources? What would my family say? There was this traditional mold for missionaries, and they are seen as beggars who don't have enough, who always have to go cap in hand looking for resources. Thankfully, I didn't have such mindset. I rather responded joyfully to God's calling upon my life to serve Him in student ministry. So I said yes with excitement and with a deep conviction that God was going to provide for all my needs. Now, this is the way it worked with me at the time and still works with me. I fully do recognize that when God calls to ministry, God's responsibility is to make available the resources to do that work. And so when God called me, I was conscious of the fact that God was going to raise people and organizations to support that work in order to get it done. As a matter of fact, I believe that when people say they are called by God to go all alone to fulfill God's purposes, I often tend to think that maybe they didn't hear what God said clearly. Because every time God calls, God would raise some people, some organizations to come alongside you to help you to fulfill the purpose of God for your life.
In my view, when I look at grant making and when I'm looking at an organization and I want to understand how closely are they following God in their calling, that's a very difficult judgment for me to make, because we don't see the heart of people. God does. We see the fruit of their work. And for me, one of the fruits of a successful mission, however you define success, because that is another whole question for another podcast. But for me, the thing I'm looking for is, are they working together with others? Are they working interdependently? Are they in partnership? Because we all have these different things that we're very good at and other things that we're weak in, and that's where the other comes in and gives us strength as we go together, as we join in these journeys, whether our part is to bring resources, to volunteer, or whether to lead or to follow. We all play a part. And so I'm always looking for the evidence that the Holy Spirit is at work in your ministry. And one of those evidences for me is your view of collaboration and partnership, and particularly in your calling and your understanding of that.
That very much agrees with my values, Rob. And in my experience in Nigeria, starting out as a staff worker, I did enjoy the blessings of collaboration, if I could put it that way. Friends of mine supported my work from my first year in student ministry, and I would take the leadership to go to churches and invite them. There are a few places in scripture that helps me to connect with churches. And there's this amazing narrative in Matthew chapter 9 that talked about Jesus visiting a certain village, and the Bible says when he saw the multitude, he was moved with compassion, because there were a set of people scattered like sheep without a shepherd. Now, in my travels, there's no better place to picture that image that Jesus was projecting than on the campuses. So when I go to the churches, I would say to the congregation, Jesus had seen far ahead into the future, and he knew the challenges of young people all over the campuses. They were like sheep without a shepherd. But Jesus said something important. He said, pray therefore that the Lord of harvest would send forth laborers to his harvest field. So my visit to your congregation as a church would achieve three purposes. One, you could pray like Jesus to send more workers to the campuses. two, in answer to that prayer, you could go as part of that labor force to help the young people on the campuses.
Whether you were full-time or part-time, or as a volunteer.
Exactly. There are various opportunities to
Time,
be with
talent,
students.
treasure.
Exactly, Rob. And then the third point, you could give where you don't have the space and the opportunity to go. You should not only pray, but you should also give to the student work, because those who are there on the field need adequate resources to function excellently. And oftentimes, most people working on the campuses have the huge challenge and distraction of inadequate funding. So the church then came in as a partner to support the work that they couldn't do because they were existing in the community. And so the church sends the organization that I work with to the campuses through their support to ensure that the work was done in the
And this was all happening in Nigeria?
Very much so in Nigeria. As a matter
without
of fact,
augmentation from outside funds.
As a matter of fact, I would always focus particularly on my city of residence. So if I was working in the southern part of Nigeria, that immediate environment becomes my constituency for the provision of resources that is needed to do God's work in that environment. In cases when I then get transferred, I would not necessarily ask my partners or donors to come with me, because I know, Rob, God has made provision for me in the place He's sending me to. I think oftentimes the point we need to keep in view is a recognition that it is God Himself who sends.
So the powerful fundraising point here, if you've come to this podcast looking for help in your own local fundraising and you're struggling in an environment or a country that's not known for its giving yet, or that you believe that the church can't do it, or it hasn't been asked to do it, how did you overcome that prejudice that you, if you were going to get started in campus work, that you needed to look outside of your local church, your local environment, and hope for some help from friends in the West or the North or somewhere else?
So I think the question you are asking me, Rob, needs to be rephrased. Because you are asking me, how did I overcome a prejudice?
By the way, Kehinde often does this for me. Helps me get more on point. Okay, thank you, brother.
Thank you, Rob. So you are asking me how I overcame a prejudice that I didn't know existed. Because when God called me as a young graduate in the early 90s, I had this all-consuming passion that my role was to make myself available. God was going to do His work through me. I wasn't even aware that there was resources somewhere else. Now, I do say this when I do my training across the world, that James 1:17 tells me that every good gift and perfect gift comes from above, and I will put in parentheses, not abroad, from the Father of light.
From above, not abroad.
From
I think we'll rename the book. From above, not abroad.
From the Father of light.
Yeah.
Who either has no shadow of turning or variableness. And I think that understanding helped me, honestly, from my first few years in ministry, to look up to God for the provision of my resources. As a matter of fact, He sent me. And I think that kept me going. So I wasn't conscious of this other option to look elsewhere. I wasn't even looking to my organization for provision.
You didn't go because it was a job that they offered you a salary and that everything was taken care of. Might not have been the same money you could have made from the oil company, but it still would have been a job to provide. You just knew that if God called you,
He would look after
He would provide.
And I was more concerned about fulfilling purpose and doing the work He's called me to do, helping young students like me at the time to discover Jesus on campus.
How did you overcome your fear of fundraising? The actual asking people for money.
Thank you, Rob. Now, this time you're not going to accuse me of rephrasing your question, because I was traveling in Mexico some years ago, and they asked me the same question you just asked me, and I paused. I paused because I was conscious of the cultural diversity, and I was careful that my honest response would not communicate any offense. So I then asked them a question. Do you really want to know whether I have a fear in fundraising? Because you have come with a presupposition that I have a fear. When you ask me how do I overcome, or why did I overcome the fear? I said, do you really want to know, guys? They said, yes, we want to know. I said, honestly, I've got phobias for many things, but not fundraising. So I didn't need to overcome a fear that didn't exist. It was a natural thought for me to invite people to be part of what God has called me to do. And those people would exist in
to join you on the journey to the destination of reaching those college students.
Exactly,
which is
Rob.
what they cared about.
Which is what they cared about, which is what they didn't have the opportunity to express like me by coming on staff full-time to do that work. So, in fact, Rob...
But they could have the joy of participating through a gift.
Rob, I like it when people give money to the ministry I work for and still tell me thank you. Do you know why? Because by inviting them to participate in the ministry with me, I have provided a platform for collaboration. So it's not just enough to provide the resources, but to thank me for creating the platform for engagement in recognition that God has called us together to do this work for Him.
We don't think of the giver having the need, do we?
Maybe we should recognize that both the givers and the receivers are both privileged by God to participate in God's kingdom.
I had a friend sitting in this chair the other day for another podcast, and after years of working in grant making, he was getting this feeling that it was just all give, and he just randomly asked one of the people coming into his office one time. He said, "Do you know what I need?" And it was a difficult question. It flummoxed the guy, but it also brought in the perspective, the whole purpose of generosity, and the role of being generous and being a participant, and what do we gain? This is really the communion of giving and receiving, that we're trying to come to this place of equals at the cross. It's not the money or the work, it's us working, it's us coming together, equals at the foot of the cross, both in need of each other, and both in need of God.
Thank you for saying that, Rob. I think the model that IFES has tried to communicate in our mentoring, coaching, and training of leaders across the 8 regions of IFES where we currently work is what you just suggested. Because why do we have fear in fundraising? Because we aren't fully recognizing that the work does not belong to us. So the anxiety comes, in my view, due to a bit of a lack of understanding. I would define generosity this way. I said generosity is not the amount given, but first a disposition of your heart. So the fact that you have the privilege to give is not first about how much you give and the causes you give to, but you recognize that you have a privilege to participate in giving, because there's nothing we have that we have not received. So we are, in some ways, investors investing in the kingdom, not necessarily getting returns, ROI, materially.
Right.
So when we come to the donor space or the giving space with that recognition that those who would use the resources are also investing like us, it becomes partnership.
Yes.
And that's the model we need to promote and we need to encourage. And that's also important, not just for the agencies, but for the missionaries who are the end users of these resources, to recognize that they have the same privilege of participation like the guys who are providing the resources, and they should approach the donor agencies. I don't like to use the word donor, I must say. I prefer the word partners. And so they should encourage the partners to identify with them in their mission, at the same time recognizing that the partners have needs just like them. And oftentimes the greatest need of a partner is relationship. because he has the resources anyway.
Right.
But a number of people who approach the partners for resources come with a mindset that they have all their needs met, and then it becomes a culture of entitlement, which is very annoying. You are just there to give me, I'm there to use it, and oftentimes they even forget to say thank you, which is very frustrating. So what we try to promote is first a recognition of kingdom, where God is the king, and we are all privileged partners with God in the task of building God's kingdom. When we come that way, we become equal at the feet of the cross, which is a phrase taken from your book, all right? So we become partners, equal partners, engaging in building God's kingdom, but playing different roles.
And the amount of the gift is not what's important here. It's the very act of giving.
That's why we have the story of the widow's mite in Scripture, because Jesus emphasized through that story.
The most celebrated donor in history, 2 pennies.
Gave little in comparison, but gave everything from the kingdom perspective. Isn't that amazing? So it's not our mathematics. It's a recognition of our privileges and our willingness to journey with God in generosity.
That's how you build the foundation. So now, let's fast forward from that beginning and from that place, and how God used all of that learning and all of that ignorance of the other system that a lot of other folks were trying to work in. And let's go 9 years ago, when you came into the position of this global director of indigenous local funding and direction, and there was another first fruit grant.
Very much so.
At this point, to help set that program up. Let's talk about that program and how effective and efficacious it's been in the countries where you work.
Yeah, thank you, Rob. Again, my appreciation goes to God and First Fruit on behalf of IFES for their generosity in seeing into the future, in providing that grant for IFES at the time. Leaders across the nation at this time were getting so frustrated because they weren't getting enough resources like they used to get to do their work locally, because most of these movements in the global south were started by the generosity of the West. So some of them sent leaders, lecturers to work in these countries, primarily with the purpose of developing student witness in universities and colleges. And that worked so well to the point that the indigenous national movement got started in many of these countries.
But then it needed to grow up and take over the work.
Exactly, because as God answers the prayers, the work grew, and then you had more students, you had more staff workers, and then you have need for more resources.
And the receiving country became a new sending country.
Right now, such that you then have need of more resources to keep the work going. And then that comes with some frustrations when the resources are not as available. So the intervention of First Fruit was to provide a grant to train, to mentor, to coach leaders of these nations in developing local resources for ministry. Now, that has gone so well in the last 9 years, even though 9 years ago it was a huge hurdle to cross. First, to convince the leaders that God is not localized, God is not regionalized. God does not only work in the western part of the world, God is for everyone. And like I said some minutes ago, the resources actually come from above, from the Father of Light. And it took a bit of allowing scriptures to speak into those cultures, to draw them out in recognizing that actually God has provided in their own local environment resources for their ministries. And so that was the first hurdle that we had to cross with the leaders, in bringing them out of their mindset, presuppositions, presumptions, to recognize that God has resources in their immediate environment with which they could do ministry in terms of time, talent, and treasures. My joy is 9 years after, that's going so well because we have increased number of staff workers in a number of the national movements where they were understaffed. And we have salaries being paid regularly now a national movement that staff members were holding in areas of 6
Because
months.
they're doing local funding.
Because now they have expanded their opportunities.
So in addition to
for
the
God's
training,
provision.
part of that grant, in addition to providing travel budget for you and other things like that, so that you could get out into the regions and spread the message and then do actual training. But one of the strong
Components.
parts of that grant was the
Matching fund.
matching funds. Tell us how that worked.
That's one major strategy that actually brought out the leaders. I think it's like the old concept of dangling a carrot. And I think everybody likes to have a bite. So that helped the leaders to be motivated to try. Because the challenge with mindset is once you are locked in, nothing gets you out.
Mm-hmm.
So the matching grant became an invitation to try something different.
And the matching grant was for new money. So
Basically, that's the clause. So if you want to get on this, you would have to make a commitment that you would raise a certain amount of money from new donors, which IFES through the grant from First Fruit could match within a certain period. That pushed the leaders to cross barriers to make the ask. And you wouldn't believe this, a number of them exceeded their expectation. Some thought they would approach 50 new donors in a given year. A particular country approached 98 new donors, and they were stunned. In one instance, a colleague of one of the staff members said to them in the office, "You can leave me out of this. I like to give as well." And so they discovered new opportunities for people to give to the kingdom within their countries that they never knew existed previously.
And the thankfulness that rises from this, I mean, all of us that have ever done any fundraising have experienced that first gift. That first time that someone gives you something and you don't give them anything tangible in return. It's a spiritual outcome that you're promising to attempt to try and pull off with the gift that they're giving you.
Yeah.
And there's just this overwhelming sense when that happens for that first time. And if the challenge grant gets you to that place where it happens, it just blows your mind that, wait a second, God is really in this. He did actually call me, and he's actually going to make this happen.
I think it's a feeling of gratitude, Rob.
Yeah.
And this is one thing I like about the ministry of fundraising. Fundraising, in my view, results in thanksgiving and gratitude to God for looking in your direction and covering you up. It's like an insurance, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's not just sending you out, it's insured you for the work He's called you to do. My first gift was a car for ministry, and it blew my mind how that came.
Because you what did you call yourselves? You were traveling secretaries at the time.
We were traveling secretaries based on the official designation, but my colleagues and I called ourselves trekking secretary because we were not only traveling. A number of times we have to trek. Maybe after getting off the commuter, we would have to trek to the campus because we didn't have any bike or a car. And imagine as a young graduate, maybe 6 months into my role, a couple just called me up and gave me a car to help me do my work effectively.
And that expanded the campuses you could go to.
Of course, I was covering 24 campuses at the time, spread across the state. And it was just impossible to go as fast if I have to go with the public transport. But then with a car, I could even wait till midnight before I started my trip back home. And that would be done with ease because I had in my care a car.
So as long as there was ministry going, you could stay on campus and make.
So it became such a blessing to have such generosity from people whom God has put in their heart to support the work I was doing on the campuses.
And really, that's what's missing out when you don't do local funding. You're missing out on giving that blessing around. Now, First Fruit likes to stay in the background. We don't like to take credit for grants, and I don't want anyone listening or viewing this podcast to think that this was about enhancing First Fruit because of that grant. It was a privilege to make that grant. It was a privilege to see what you did with that grant, to be a part of this expansion of this work. And in our next podcast with Kehinde, we're going to talk about another thing that he's doing. So if you're watching this and you're wondering, how can I get in on the training that he's doing at IFES and other things like that, we're going to talk about something called the Ministry Fundraising Network. And Kehinde is the co-catalyst, another term for director, of that network, and we'll expand on what that means and how you can be a part of that if you wish. Thank you, Kehinde.
Thank you, Rob.